There is a moment, and most people never notice it, when you stop making your own choices. It happens quietly. It happens gradually, and by the time it has happened, it feels completely normal. It feels like common sense. It feels like the obvious thing to do. But it is not your choice. Not really. It is the crowd's choice, and you are simply moving with it. Think about the last major decision you made: where you live, what you do for work, how you spend your evenings, how you think about success, how you define a good life. Ask yourself honestly, how much of that was something you decided, and how much of it was simply absorbed from the people around you, from the culture you grew up in, from what your friends were doing, from what seemed normal. Most people, when they think carefully, discover that a surprising number of their choices were never really choices at all. They were defaults, inherited assumptions, directions that were handed to them before they were old enough to question them. This is not a judgment. This is simply how human beings work. You are a social creature. You are wired to observe others, to adjust your behavior based on what is around you, to look for cues from the group. This is not a flaw. For most of human history, this instinct kept people alive. If everyone around you ran, you ran. If everyone around you stopped, you stopped. The group was often smarter than the individual, or at the very least, safer. But something changed. The world you live in now is not the world that built those instincts. You no longer need the crowd to survive. You need to think clearly, independently, for yourself, in order to grow. And that is where the old instinct becomes a liability, because the crowd is not always wrong, but the crowd is often not moving in a direction that serves you specifically. The crowd moves toward what is familiar, toward what is comfortable, toward what requires the least friction. And when you follow that movement without awareness, you end up somewhere that was never yours to begin with. Here is what is interesting about this. Most people who follow the crowd do not think of themselves as followers. They think of themselves as reasonable, practical, just doing what makes sense. And that is precisely why the pattern is so difficult to see. It does not feel like following. It feels like common sense. But common sense is often just common behavior. And common behavior is not designed around your particular life, your particular potential, or your particular direction. It is designed around the average. And if you follow the average long enough, you arrive at an average outcome. This audiobook is not about becoming superior to other people. It is not about looking down on the crowd or separating yourself from humanity. What it is about is something far more specific and far more useful. It is about developing the awareness to notice when you are being pulled by forces you did not consciously choose. It is about building the mental clarity to think for yourself in a world that makes that harder than it should be. It is about growing in a direction that is genuinely yours. Because here is what most people eventually realize, usually later than they would like: the path that leads somewhere meaningful is almost never the most crowded path. Not because the crowd is bad or wrong, but because meaningful paths are personal. They require something specific to you. And the crowd, by definition, offers something general. So, the question is not whether you are smarter than everyone else. The question is whether you are paying attention to your own life clearly enough to move in the direction that actually serves you. Most people are not, and it is not because they are incapable. It is because they have never been shown how to look. That is what this audiobook is about. Not motivation, not a shortcut, not a formula for becoming extraordinary overnight. What it offers is something slower and more durable than that. It offers a way of seeing, a way of thinking, a set of habits and awareness practices that, over time, create real separation between where you are and where the crowd tends to drift. You will not feel the change immediately. That is part of what you need to understand going in. The kind of growth this audiobook describes is not loud. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It builds quietly over months and years until one day you look back and realize you are standing somewhere very different from where you would have ended up if you had simply kept moving with the flow. That is what outgrowing looks like. That is what outthinking looks like. That is what outperforming looks like. Not a moment of sudden brilliance. A long, consistent, deliberate accumulation of small differences. And it begins with one thing: the willingness to pause and notice. To stop for a moment, look at the direction you are moving, and ask a simple question. Is this mine? Did I choose this? Or did I simply inherit it? Most people never ask that question, and so they never get to answer it. You are asking it now. That is where this begins. To understand why most people follow the crowd, you have to understand something about the way the mind works under pressure. The human brain is, among many things, an energy management system. It is constantly making decisions about where to spend its limited resources. And thinking, real thinking, careful, deliberate reasoning, is expensive. It takes energy. It takes time. It creates discomfort because it often leads you into uncertainty. And the brain does not like uncertainty. It prefers resolution. It prefers the feeling of already knowing. So whenever possible, the brain looks for shortcuts. And one of the most powerful shortcuts available is the behavior of other people. When you do not know what to do, you look at what others are doing. When you are unsure what to think, you look at what others seem to think. When you feel uncertain about a direction, you check whether the people around you seem to be moving that way. This is not laziness. This is efficiency. The brain is outsourcing the work of figuring things out to a source it considers reliable, the collective behavior of the group. This is called social proof, and it is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior. The remarkable thing about it is not that it exists. It is that it operates almost entirely below the level of conscious awareness. You do not feel yourself scanning the room for cues. You do not feel yourself adjusting your thinking based on what seems popular. It just happens. And because it just happens, most people never question it. Think about how this plays out in everyday life. Someone you know starts a business, it fails. You absorb that data point. The next time the idea of starting a business surfaces for you, the memory is already there, working quietly. You did not consciously decide that business is dangerous. But the instinct has already shifted. The crowd's experience has become your expectation. Or think about ambition. You grow up in an environment where a certain income level is considered successful, where a certain type of job is considered respectable, where certain behaviors are praised and others are quietly discouraged. You do not choose those standards. You absorb them. And then, years later, you measure your own life against them without realizing you adopted them from the outside. This is how most people's sense of what is possible gets defined, not by their actual potential, not by deliberate consideration of what they want, by the standards of the group they are most exposed to. And here is where it becomes important. The crowd is not made up of bad people. It is made up of people doing exactly what you do, absorbing, adjusting, following the patterns around them. The crowd perpetuates itself. Each person looking at the others and taking cues. Each person reinforcing the norms that everyone else is also reinforcing. It is a closed loop, and it is almost invisible from the inside. There is another layer to this. Beyond the automatic behavior patterns, there is something more deliberate at work. Social belonging. Human beings have a deep need to belong. This is not a weakness. It is one of the most fundamental aspects of what you are. You need connection. You need to feel part of something. You need the approval and acceptance of the people around you. And you will go to significant lengths, often unconscious lengths, to protect that belonging. This means that when your thinking begins to deviate from the group, something interesting happens. You feel resistance. Not always from other people, though that too, but from inside yourself, a kind of discomfort at being different, a subtle anxiety that standing apart might cost you something, and that discomfort is often enough to pull you back toward the crowd, even when the crowd is moving in a direction that does not serve you. This is why most people do not change, even when they know change is necessary. It is not because they lack information. It is because change often requires you to become different from the people around you. And that difference, even when it is clearly beneficial, feels threatening at a very deep level. Think about the person who wants to eat more carefully, but their entire social circle revolves around a certain way of eating. Or the person who wants to think more ambitiously, but everyone they know has a very specific ceiling on what is considered realistic. Or the person who wants to build something new, but whose environment treats stability and predictability as the highest virtues. The information is not the obstacle. The environment is. And most people, when faced with the friction between who they are becoming and the expectations of the crowd around them, choose the crowd. Not consciously, but they choose it, because the cost of belonging feels more immediate than the cost of staying the same. This is the core of the problem. The crowd is not just external, it lives inside you, in your assumptions, in your instincts, in the quiet sense of what is normal and what is not. And until you learn to see it there, it will continue to shape you without your awareness. Here is something worth sitting with. Most people's limitations are not intellectual, they are environmental. The smartest person in a room where nothing is expected will tend to produce nothing. Not because they lack ability, but because ability without the right conditions tends to go dormant. And the conditions are set, more than most people realize, by the crowd. The way out of this is not to fight the crowd. You cannot win that fight, and more importantly, it is the wrong fight. The way out is subtler than that. It begins with awareness, with the ability to look at your own thinking and ask, where did this come from? Is this mine, or did I absorb it? That question, asked with genuine honesty and regularity, is the beginning of real independence. Not independence as a performance. Not independence as rebellion, but independence as clarity. The ability to see clearly, to think clearly, and to move in directions that are genuinely chosen rather than inherited. And that begins with understanding something that most people never fully grasp. The fact that you have been shaped by your environment does not make you weak. It makes you human. The difference between people who move beyond the crowd and people who do not is not that some people are immune to social influence. They are not. No one is. The difference is that some people become aware of it. And awareness, even partial awareness, changes everything. There is a version of you that your current environment expects. You may not have named it. You may not even be fully aware of it. But it is there. In the way the people around you treat you. In the assumptions they make about what you will do and how you will behave. In the conversations that feel natural and the conversations that create tension. In the version of you that fits smoothly into your surroundings without anyone having to adjust. That version of you is not necessarily bad, but it is also not the full picture. Because you are capable of more than your environment expects. Almost certainly. Not in some vague motivational sense, but in the very specific sense that every environment, by nature, shapes the people within it. And the shaping is not always upward. Sometimes it is lateral, sometimes it is a narrowing. A way of defining what is realistic, what is possible, what is worth pursuing. And none of those definitions are objective. They are simply the product of the particular context you are in. To outgrow your environment is not to escape it dramatically. It is not to declare it inferior or to cut away from everyone and everything around you. It is something quieter and more precise. It is to develop the parts of yourself that your environment has not yet reached. To grow in directions your surroundings did not predict. To become, gradually, someone slightly larger than the container that was set for you. This begins with honesty. You need to look at your current environment clearly and ask a specific set of questions. Not in a spirit of criticism, but in a spirit of audit. What does this environment reward? What does it discourage? What kind of person does it tend to produce? And is that the kind of person you are trying to become? These questions are uncomfortable, which is why most people avoid them. It is far easier to simply exist within an environment than to examine it, to go along with the norms, the expectations, the rhythms of what is around you. Examination requires a degree of distance. And distance, even psychological distance, can feel like disloyalty. But the truth is, you cannot grow beyond what you are willing to see clearly. If you cannot look at your environment honestly, you cannot outgrow it. You can only stay within it, shaped by forces you refuse to acknowledge. So let yourself look. Most environments operate on invisible assumptions, things that are never said but deeply understood. In some environments, ambition is celebrated. In others, it is subtly punished. It makes other people uncomfortable. It creates a sense of gap between you and those around you, and because belonging matters so much, the ambitious person often learns to hide that ambition, to downplay it, to shrink back to the size that the environment can accommodate. This is not a conscious process. It is deeply automatic. But the result is real. Genuine potential, repeatedly adjusted downward to fit the expectations of the room. And over time, the adjustment becomes so natural that the person forgets they ever wanted more. The ceiling that was external has become internal. You can reverse this process, but it requires understanding something important. The environment does not change first. You change first. And then the relationship to the environment changes. Sometimes the environment itself changes in response. Sometimes it does not. But the sequence matters. You cannot wait for your surroundings to become supportive before you begin growing. That sequence, for most people, never arrives. So what does it mean to change first? It means beginning to invest in the version of yourself that your environment has not yet seen. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly and consistently. In the books you read, the ideas you expose yourself to, the skills you build when no one is watching. In the conversations you seek out with people who are further along the path you want to walk. In the decisions you make that are slightly more aligned with where you are going than with where you have been. The key is slightly, because dramatic change generates enormous resistance from your environment and from yourself. But slight, consistent change slips past resistance. It accumulates slowly. And slowly is the speed at which real transformation tends to happen. Think about habits for a moment, because this is where environment and growth intersect most practically. Your environment is, among other things, a habit machine. It creates conditions that make certain behaviors automatic and others difficult. If you live and work among people who stay up late, sleeping early becomes friction. If you are surrounded by people who never exercise, building a fitness habit requires you to swim against a current that is largely invisible. If your environment normalizes distraction, constant social media, constant noise, constant consumption of other people's content, then focused work becomes genuinely difficult. Not because you are weak, because the environment is designed, however unintentionally, to produce a different pattern. To outgrow your environment at the level of habits means doing two things simultaneously. First, reducing the friction on the behaviors that serve your growth. Second, increasing the friction on the behaviors that don't. This sounds simple. It is not easy, but it is concrete and actionable in a way that most advice about growth is not. Reducing friction means making the good behaviors easier to start. If you want to read more, put a book on your pillow. If you want to write, keep a notebook open on your desk. If you want to exercise, sleep in your workout clothes. These are small adjustments, but they work by cooperating with the brain's preference for ease. You are not relying on motivation. You are engineering the conditions for the behavior. Increasing friction means making the unhelpful behaviors harder to access. If social media is draining your focus, delete the apps from your phone. If you are spending your evenings in ways that do not serve you, reorganize the environment so those patterns are harder to fall into. Every additional step between you and an unhelpful habit creates a window, a moment where the more deliberate version of you can intervene. These are environmental adjustments, and the reason they matter is that willpower is unreliable. On a good day, you can resist. On a difficult day, you cannot. But if the environment is structured to support the behavior you want, the good days and the difficult days produce similar results. The environment carries the load that willpower cannot consistently carry. Now, there is another dimension to outgrowing your environment that people often underestimate: the people dimension. Jim Rohn's observation that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with has been repeated so often that it has nearly become a cliché. But the underlying truth is real and worth taking seriously. The people around you shape your sense of what is normal. Your standard of conversation, ambition, effort, discipline, and possibility is calibrated largely against the people you spend the most time with. This does not mean you need to discard your relationships. It does not mean you should coldly calculate the value of every friendship. What it means is that you need to be intentional about adding to the range of people you are influenced by, not replacing, expanding. If every person you spend significant time with has a similar ceiling of ambition, a similar range of ideas, a similar relationship to effort and discipline, then that range becomes your range. Not because you decided it, because the calibration is constant and automatic. When you deliberately seek out exposure to people who are operating at levels different from your current circle, through books, through mentorship, through communities, through whatever access is available, you begin to recalibrate, not dramatically, gradually. The sense of what is normal begins to shift. What once seemed like an exceptional level of effort starts to look like a reasonable baseline. What once seemed like an unusual level of ambition starts to feel like a realistic direction. This is why the reading habit matters so much for growth. A book is, among other things, access to the thinking of someone who has been somewhere you have not yet been, and repeated exposure to that thinking changes your internal baseline. Your standards for yourself, quietly and without announcement, begin to rise. The process of outgrowing your environment also involves something that is rarely discussed directly. It involves tolerating the discomfort of being slightly out of sync with your surroundings. As you grow, there will be moments where you feel a gap between who you are becoming and the expectations of the people around you. You will think differently than you used to. You will want different things. You will have less patience for conversations and patterns that once felt completely natural. This is normal. It is the friction of growth. And it is uncomfortable enough that many people stop at this point. They feel the gap and interpret it as a sign that something is wrong, that they are becoming arrogant, that they are losing something important, and so they pull back. They shrink themselves back to the size that fits, and the growth stops. What you need to understand is that the discomfort of growing beyond your environment is not a sign of arrogance or disconnection. It is the feeling of expansion. The container is being stretched, and the stretching is uncomfortable before it becomes natural. The gap you feel is not permanent. Over time, one of two things happens. Either your environment grows along with you, people around you are inspired by the changes you are making, the conversations deepen, the collective standard rises, or you gradually find yourself gravitating toward new environments that better match who you are becoming. New relationships, new communities, new contexts where the person you are growing into feels at home. Both of these are good outcomes, but neither of them happens if you stop at the discomfort. So the instruction here is simple, even if the practice is not. Keep going. Grow quietly. Do not announce it. Do not perform it. Do not make it about the distance between you and others. Simply focus on the next small thing, the next habit, the next book, the next skill, the next conversation with someone who thinks differently. Let the growth accumulate. Let the environment shift in response. and trust that the discomfort of the gap is not a warning to stop. It is a signal that something real is happening. Because something is, and it is only going to compound over time. Most of the time, you are not really thinking. This is not an insult. It is a description of how the mind works at its most efficient. The brain builds patterns, mental shortcuts, automatic routines, default responses, and then runs those patterns without requiring much conscious input. This is how you can drive a car while holding a conversation, how you can perform familiar tasks while your attention is somewhere else entirely. The pattern runs, you coast. This efficiency is remarkable, and it is also one of the primary reasons most people's thinking stays shallow. Because the patterns were built a long time ago. They were built from a particular set of experiences in a particular environment with a particular set of beliefs already in place. And they keep running, long after the experiences that built them are no longer relevant, long after better patterns are available. To outthink is not to become smarter in the IQ sense. It is to become more aware of your own automatic patterns, to notice when you are on autopilot, to develop the capacity to pause, look at your own thinking, and ask whether the pattern you are running is actually serving you, or just running because it was built first. This is sometimes called metacognition, thinking about thinking, and it is one of the most underused capabilities available to you. Here is how automatic patterns typically operate. Something happens, a situation, a challenge, a piece of information, and before you have had a conscious thought, your mind has already responded. An emotion has arisen, a judgment has been made, a behavioral impulse has been triggered. By the time your conscious mind shows up, the interpretation is already in place, and the conscious mind, more often than not, simply endorses the interpretation and builds a rationale around it. This is the backward nature of much human reasoning. You do not always reason your way to a conclusion. You often arrive at the conclusion automatically and then reason to justify it. The reasoning feels real. It feels deliberate and careful, but it is often working in service of a decision that was already made at a faster, less conscious level. Understanding this is not meant to make you distrust yourself. It is meant to create a useful pause, a moment between the automatic response and the action. In that pause, something different becomes possible. You can ask, is this pattern actually accurate? Is this interpretation actually true? Or is this just the pattern I built a long time ago, running again? One of the most common automatic patterns is the one built around what is possible. From a very young age, you develop a sense of what is realistic for someone like you. This sense is built from observation. What people in your family achieved, what people in your environment pursued, what succeeded, and what failed in your particular world. And it becomes a deeply embedded assumption, not a conscious belief that you have examined and endorsed, but a background condition, a floor below which your thinking does not naturally fall, and a ceiling above which it does not naturally rise. This is why two people with identical intelligence and opportunity can end up in dramatically different places. Their intelligence is the same, their circumstances may be similar, but their internally constructed sense of what is possible is not. And the one who was given, or somehow developed, a larger internal horizon will consistently attempt more, persist longer, and ultimately achieve more. Not because they are more capable, because their automatic pattern of what is realistic is set higher. This is one of the most important things you can work on. Not your skills in isolation, not your habits in isolation, but the underlying assumptions about what you are capable of and what is possible for your life, because those assumptions are the operating system that all your other efforts run on. And if the operating system has a low ceiling built in, everything you try to build above that ceiling will be quietly limited. How do you change these deep patterns? It is not quick, and it is not simple, but there are specific things you can do. The first is exposure. When you are repeatedly exposed to evidence that a thing is possible, that someone built something extraordinary, lived differently, achieved what others said was unrealistic, your automatic sense of possibility begins to shift. Not all at once, but the exposure accumulates, the evidence builds, and gradually the internal pattern updates. This is why biography matters so much, not as inspiration in the surface sense, but as recalibration. When you study the life of someone who did something genuinely remarkable, you are feeding your mind evidence that the thing is achievable. Your brain does not easily distinguish between what you witnessed in person and what you read vividly. The exposure still moves the needle. The second thing that changes automatic patterns is questioning. There is a habit, and it is a habit, something you can practice, of pausing regularly and asking, what am I assuming here? Not in a paranoid or anxious way, in a curious way, because most of the assumptions that limit you are not dramatically wrong. They are just slightly off, calibrated for a situation that no longer exists, based on data that is outdated, running on a pattern that made sense once but has not been re-examined. The simple act of noticing that an assumption is there begins to loosen its grip. You cannot question what you cannot see, and most assumptions operate invisibly. The moment you name it, the moment you say, I am assuming that this is too difficult, I am assuming that I do not have what it takes, I am assuming that this kind of outcome is not for people like me, it becomes something you can look at rather than something that is simply looking through you. Then you can ask the next question. What is the evidence for this assumption? When did I form it? Does it still apply? Often, the answer is revealing. The assumption was formed when you were younger. It was based on a single experience or a limited set of experiences that has since been taken as a general truth, or it was absorbed from someone else. A parent, a teacher, a peer, who had their own reasons for believing it that had nothing to do with your particular situation. The assumption has been operating as fact, but it was never fact. It was just a pattern that got established and never questioned. The third element of outthinking is what might be called perspective shifting. Most automatic thinking is narrow. It sees a situation from a single angle, usually the first angle that presented itself, which is usually the most emotionally charged one, and that angle determines the interpretation, which determines the response. The practice of deliberately taking other perspectives, of asking, what would this look like from a different position? How might someone else see this? What would this situation look like in 10 years rather than right now? Creates cognitive flexibility. It does not always change your conclusion, but it creates space around the automatic response. And in that space, a more considered, more accurate interpretation often emerges. This is especially important in decisions, when you are in the grip of a strong emotional response, fear, excitement, frustration, urgency. Your thinking narrows, the options that are visible become fewer, the time horizon compresses, everything feels immediate, and decisions made in that narrowed state are almost always less good than decisions made from a wider perspective. The discipline of perspective shifting is the practice of deliberately widening the view at the moments when it most wants to narrow. Taking a breath, asking what you would advise a close friend to do in the same situation. Looking at what you will think of this decision in a year, running the pattern forward in time and asking what it produces over a longer arc. These are not complicated techniques. They are simple habits of thought that most people simply never develop. And the reason most people never develop them is that automatic thinking is so much faster and more efficient. Why do the work of deliberate perspective shifting when the automatic answer is right there, immediately available? The answer is that the automatic answer is not always right. And in the situations that matter most, the difference between the automatic response and the more considered one can be enormous. There is another aspect of automatic thinking that deserves specific attention, and that is the way you think about other people's success. In most people, When they observe someone who has achieved something significant, a set of automatic patterns triggers: comparison, envy, dismissal, or sometimes the opposite, excessive admiration that creates distance rather than learning. This is worth examining carefully. The automatic pattern of dismissal goes something like this. When someone else succeeds in a way that highlights the distance between where they are and where you are, the mind looks for a way to neutralize the discomfort. It finds reasons to discount the achievement. He was lucky. She had advantages I don't have. That is not the kind of success I actually want. And while any of these things might contain some truth, the function of the pattern is not accuracy. It is protection. Protecting you from the discomfort of the gap. The problem is that this pattern, while emotionally efficient, is informationally wasteful, because other people's success, even when achieved in conditions different from yours, contains something useful. Evidence of what is possible. Demonstration of how certain patterns of behavior lead to certain outcomes. You do not need to replicate someone else's path, but you can extract the principles and apply them to your own. To outthink this pattern means to shift from comparison, which produces nothing useful, to curiosity, from why do they have what I don't, to what can I understand about how they got there, from defensiveness to inquiry. This shift is not always comfortable. It requires looking at something that might highlight your own gaps. But it is the more intelligent response. And intelligence, in this context, is not native. It is practiced. There is one more dimension of automatic thinking that shapes outcomes in ways most people underestimate. How you think about effort. Most people, without realizing it, have an automatic pattern around effort that goes something like this. If I have to work hard at something, it means I am not naturally good at it. If it does not come easily, maybe it is not for me. This pattern is subtle. It feels like self-knowledge. It feels like realism. But it is actually one of the most limiting patterns available. Because almost nothing significant comes easily. Almost nothing worth building requires no difficulty. The difficulty is not a sign that you are in the wrong place. It is often a sign that you are in exactly the right place, at the edge of what you can currently do, which is where growth happens. The people who consistently develop across every field are the ones who have updated this automatic pattern, who have come to understand that difficulty is information, not about their suitability, but about where the growth edge is, and who have developed enough equanimity around that difficulty to stay in it rather than retreating to the easier, more familiar territory where no real growth is occurring. This update does not happen automatically. It has to be deliberately built. But once it is built, it changes everything, because then difficulty is not discouraging, it is directional. It points you toward exactly the place where your effort will have the most impact. Outthinking is, ultimately, about becoming the observer of your own mind, not in a detached, dissociated way, but in the way that a skilled craftsman observes their own work, with attention, with curiosity, with the willingness to notice what is not working and adjust. The mind that can watch itself is the mind that can evolve itself. And that evolution, quiet and internal as it is, produces visible and lasting results. There is a version of performance that most people aspire to, the version where inspiration strikes, energy surges, and enormous effort produces enormous results. The version that looks dramatic from the outside, that generates attention. That feels, in the moment, like something important is happening. And there is the actual version of high performance. The version that is not particularly dramatic. That does not look remarkable from the outside. That does not come with a surge of energy or a wave of inspiration. That is, by nature, quiet and repetitive and ordinary. That second version is the one that actually produces results over time. The most common mistake people make when thinking about performance is that they conflate intensity with consistency. They believe that the more intense the effort, the better the outcome. That if they could just find the right surge of motivation, the right burst of energy, the right extraordinary moment, they would break through to a new level. But this is not how performance works, not over meaningful timescales. Over meaningful timescales, what separates people is not intensity. It is regularity. The person who works at their craft for 2 hours every day, without exception for 3 years, will almost always outperform the person who works in intense bursts interspersed with long periods of inaction, even if the burst person's peak intensity is higher, because the cumulative total of consistent daily work dwarfs what intermittent intensity can produce. This seems obvious when stated directly, and yet the pattern that most people actually follow is the burst pattern. They are waiting for the right mood, for the surge, for the moment when it feels right, and when the moment comes, they pour enormous energy into it. And when it passes, they wait for the next one. The problem with this approach is that it depends entirely on a resource you cannot control: motivation, inspiration, the right feeling. These things are not reliable. They come and go. They are influenced by sleep, by mood, by what happened that day, by 100 factors that have nothing to do with what you are trying to build. And a process that depends on them is a fragile process. Consistency does not depend on motivation. That is the key distinction. Consistent performance is built on systems, on habits, on commitments that run independently of how you feel, on the understanding that the work gets done not because you feel like doing it, but because the time for it has arrived. And you do it, regardless. This is a significant shift in how most people relate to their own work. For most people, the presence or absence of motivation is a legitimate reason to work or not work. If the motivation is there, they work. If it is not, they wait, and they experience this as reasonable, as self-aware, as not forcing things. But what they are actually doing is outsourcing the decision about whether to work to a psychological state that has no reliable pattern. They are not in control of their output. Their mood is. The shift to consistency means taking that control back. It means deciding in advance when you will work and for how long, and then honoring that decision regardless of the psychological weather. Not because feelings do not matter, but because the work is too important to be conditional on feelings. And here is what happens when you do this consistently. The reliance on motivation gradually diminishes, not because motivation disappears, but because you no longer need it. The habit takes over. The time arrives. You sit down and the work begins. Not because you feel inspired, because it is time, and you have done it enough times that the pattern is now automatic. This is one of the most significant transitions in any high performer's development. The point at which the work stops being something they have to force themselves into and becomes simply something they do. Part of the rhythm, part of the structure. As natural as eating or sleeping, getting to that point takes time, and it takes tolerating a period in which the work is being done without the support of motivation. This period is uncomfortable. It feels like forcing things, like going through the motions. And for some people, this discomfort becomes a reason to stop. They interpret the absence of inspiration as a signal that they are doing something wrong, that they should wait until the energy returns. But that interpretation is incorrect. The discomfort of working without motivation is not a warning sign. It is the early stage of building the habit. The resistance is normal. The friction is normal. You push through it not because it will always feel like this, but because the friction is temporary and the habit, once built, is durable. Let us talk about what consistency actually looks like in practice. It looks like showing up every day, not just on the days when you feel good. Every day, in some form, even if the form is smaller than you would like, even if you have only 20 minutes, even if the output is not particularly good. The continuity of showing up matters more than the quality of any individual session. This is counterintuitive for people who have been told that quality is everything, and quality does matter. But quality tends to emerge from quantity over time. The musician who plays every day, even imperfectly, develops skill at a rate that the musician who plays only when inspired cannot match. The writer who writes every day produces work that, over time, is far better than the writer who waits for inspiration, because writing every day is itself the training that produces better writing. The output of consistent practice compounds. Each session builds on the previous one. Skills develop incrementally. Understanding deepens through repeated exposure, and the things that were difficult become progressively less so. The trajectory created by consistent daily practice, sustained over months and years, is not linear. It curves upward. The early results are modest, and the improvement is slow and difficult to see. But the longer the consistency continues, the steeper the curve becomes. This is why patience is not optional when it comes to genuine performance. You cannot see the compound curve in the early stages. You can only see that the day's work did not produce dramatic results. You can only feel the distance between where you are and where you want to be. And that distance, unmediated by the understanding of compounding, is discouraging enough to stop most people. The ones who continue are not necessarily more motivated. They are simply better at understanding the math of the long game. They know that the absence of visible early results is not evidence that the work is not working. It is evidence that the curve is still in its early phase, and they keep going. There is a specific quality that consistent performers tend to develop, which might be called tolerance for ordinariness. The ability to sit with the reality that today's work is not exceptional, that today's session did not produce a breakthrough, that the progress is invisible and the day looks, from the outside, exactly like any other day, and to find that acceptable, even to find it comfortable. For people who are driven by the desire for recognition or dramatic progress, this tolerance is hard to build. They need visible evidence that something significant is happening. And when that evidence is absent, as it usually is during the long middle stretch of any meaningful endeavor, the absence feels like failure. It feels like being stuck. But being stuck and being in the long middle are not the same thing. The long middle is where almost all real progress happens. It is the invisible stretch between the exciting beginning and the visible result. It is where most people give up, and giving up in the long middle means throwing away the cumulative value of everything that came before. What sustains consistency during the long middle is not motivation, it is clarity. Clarity about what you are building, why it matters, and the understanding that the current invisibility of results is a feature of the process, not a sign of failure. There is also something to be said about what consistency does to your character, independent of the external results it produces. Every time you honor the commitment to do the work, when you do not feel like it, you are building something, not just the skill or the project or the outcome you are working toward. You are building evidence for yourself that you are the kind of person who follows through, that your commitments are real, that when you say you will do something, you do it. This internal evidence accumulates, and it changes the way you relate to yourself. The confidence that comes from consistent self-honoring is different from the confidence that comes from success. Success is external and variable. You can succeed, and then fail and lose the confidence that was built on success. But the confidence that comes from knowing you show up, regardless, is built on something more stable, on a demonstrated pattern of your own behavior, on the knowledge that your word to yourself means something. This is what genuine self-trust looks like, and it is built through consistency, one day at a time, one session at a time, one kept commitment at a time. The crowd tends to perform in bursts, motivated by surges of enthusiasm, deflated by the inevitable return to ordinary conditions. The person who outperforms the crowd is not necessarily more talented or more inspired. They are simply more consistent. They show up every day. They do the work. They tolerate the ordinariness of the long middle. They understand the math of compounding. And over time, the accumulation of that consistency produces something that looks, To observers who did not watch the daily work like exceptional ability. It is not exceptional ability, it is the product of exceptional regularity, and regularity is available to you right now, today, without any special equipment, any dramatic circumstances or any surge of motivation. You simply begin, you set the time, you show up, and then you do it again the next day. That is the whole process, and that process, sustained long enough, produces everything. The modern world is, among many other things, a machine for consuming attention. It is not designed with your focus in mind. It is designed with your engagement in mind, which is a very different thing. Engagement is attention that can be captured and held, often against your better interest, in service of someone else's purpose. Your attention is the product, and the systems designed to capture it are extraordinarily sophisticated. This is not new information. Most people, when they think about it, understand this. They know that social media is designed to be addictive. They know that their phone is a distraction. They know that the notifications, the scrolling, the constant availability of stimulation are working against their focus. They know this. And yet knowing it changes very little for most people. Because the problem is not informational, it is structural. The distraction is built into the environment so deeply, so seamlessly, that resisting it requires a constant, active effort. And that effort competes with the limited willpower that is also needed for everything else. Eventually, the willpower runs low, the distraction wins, and the focus that was needed for something important never arrives. This is the reality most people are navigating, largely without a clear strategy, and the result is a kind of chronic fragmentation. A sense that time is passing, that effort is being made, and yet the things that really matter are somehow not advancing. The day fills with activity, emails, messages, meetings, scrolling, responding, reacting, and at the end of it, the work that would have moved something meaningful forward has not been done. This is not laziness. It is the natural consequence of operating in an environment that is structured to produce exactly this outcome. To reclaim your focus, you need to understand something fundamental. Attention is not infinitely renewable. It is a resource that depletes with use and recovers with rest. And the quality of what you produce is directly proportional to the quality of the attention you bring to it. Fractured attention produces fractured work. Sustained, deep attention produces something different, something of a different quality entirely. This is why the ability to focus, genuinely focus, for extended periods on a single task, is one of the most valuable and most scarce capacities in the current environment. Almost everyone has access to the same information. Almost everyone has access to similar tools. The differentiator is not intelligence or access. It is the ability to sit with one thing long enough to go deep with it. Deep work, the kind of focused, sustained engagement with a difficult task that produces real results, is becoming simultaneously more valuable and more rare. More valuable because the world increasingly rewards the products of deep thinking. More rare because the environment makes deep thinking increasingly difficult. And this gap between value and availability is where real separation is created. The person who learns to focus in a world of distraction is not just more productive. They are operating in a fundamentally different way from most of the people around them. The quality of their thinking is different. The depth of their work is different. The outputs they are capable of are different. Not because they are smarter, because they protect the conditions that allow deep thinking to happen. So what does it actually look like to protect those conditions? It begins with recognition, not just intellectual recognition that distraction is a problem, but a concrete, honest accounting of where your attention is actually going. Most people, if they tracked their attention for a single week, would be surprised, and often troubled, by what they found. The amount of time spent on activities that produce nothing of lasting value. The number of times the phone is checked in an hour, the way a single notification can break a period of focus, and require 20 minutes to fully recover. This tracking is not about self-punishment. It is about making the invisible visible, because until you see clearly where your attention goes, you cannot make informed choices about it. Once you can see it, the next step is structure. Not discipline alone, because discipline alone is insufficient. Structure. Designing your day so that the conditions for focused work are created deliberately, rather than hoping that focus will somehow emerge from an unstructured environment. What this typically looks like is designating specific time for deep, focused work and treating that time as protected. Not available for meetings, not available for email, not available for messages or phone calls. Simply the work, for a fixed period. Without interruption, the length of that period matters less than its consistency and protection. An uninterrupted hour of genuine focus produces more than 3 fragmented hours of distracted effort. Not because of the time differential, because of what sustained attention makes possible. The ability to go deeper into a problem, to hold more complexity in mind at once, to find connections and insights that surface only after an extended period of focused engagement. Interruptions do not just take the time they consume, they take the recovery time as well. Research consistently shows that after a significant interruption, it takes many minutes to return to the previous level of focus. Every notification, every message, every break in attention costs more than the surface interruption suggests. Understanding this should shift how you think about the costs of distraction. It is not just the time lost in the distraction itself. It is the depth lost, the quality lost, the thinking that was never completed because the conditions for it were never protected. Eliminating distraction also means getting honest about the specific forms it takes in your life. For many people, the phone is the primary source. The habit of reaching for it reflexively, dozens of times a day, at every pause and moment of stillness. The phone has become, for many people, a way of avoiding the discomfort of an unoccupied moment, of not having a task immediately in front of them. And the brain, which does not enjoy discomfort, has learned to treat the phone as the solution. Any moment of stillness, any moment of uncertainty, any moment of the mildly uncomfortable sensation of not knowing what to do next, the phone fills it. This is not a moral failure. It is a conditioned response, but it has a cost, because the moments of stillness, of not having a task immediately in front of you, are not wasted moments. They are often the moments when the most valuable thinking happens. The subconscious mind works on problems in the background, and the solutions tend to surface in moments of quiet, in the shower, on a walk, in the space between one thing and the next. When those moments are perpetually filled with external stimulation, the solutions never get to surface. Creating space, deliberate, protected space, is not laziness. It is one of the most productive things you can do. The mind needs room to move, to make connections, to process what it has absorbed, and a mind that is constantly consuming has no room for that. There is also the question of the quality of what you consume. Most content consumption is passive and low resolution. It feels like learning but produces very little actual understanding. The scroll through social media, the quick scan of headlines, the half-engaged watching of video content, these activities create the sensation of being informed without producing the deep engagement that actually changes your thinking. Compare this to the kind of reading that requires you to hold an argument in your mind, follow its logic, notice its weaknesses, make connections to other things you know, and form your own conclusions. This kind of engagement is not efficient in the sense of covering a lot of ground quickly, but it is efficient in the sense that actually matters. It changes you. It adds to your capacity. It becomes part of how you think. Most people do very little of this kind of reading and a great deal of the passive, low-resolution kind. And the result is a surface-level familiarity with many things and genuine depth in almost none. Shifting toward depth means making choices about attention that are often uncomfortable in the short term, reading something slow and difficult when something fast and easy is available, sitting with a complex problem when the distraction of simpler pleasures is right there, protecting the quiet when noise is immediately accessible. But those choices, made consistently, compound in exactly the same way that consistent work compounds. Each investment in depth adds to the capacity for depth. The mind that practices sustained attention becomes better at sustained attention. The mind that is perpetually fragmented becomes progressively less capable of the focus that meaningful work requires. To outperform the crowd in a world of distraction, you do not need exceptional willpower. You need a good structure, an environment designed to protect the conditions for focused work. Clear agreements with yourself about when you are available and when you are not, and a clear understanding of what your attention is worth and what you are choosing to spend it on. Because attention, ultimately, is time. Your attention is where your life is actually happening, and the degree to which you allow it to be captured by external systems and automatic habits determines the degree to which your actual life, the one you could be building, remains unbuilt. Protect your attention, not as an act of discipline alone, as an act of understanding what it actually is. It is not a luxury. It is the material from which everything you want to create is made. Most people overestimate what they can accomplish in a year, and they dramatically underestimate what they can accomplish in a decade. This is one of the most consequential cognitive distortions in human behavior. The time horizon through which most people evaluate their progress is too short, compressed, set to a scale that makes meaningful growth look like slow progress and slow progress look like failure. And so they stop, or they pivot, or they conclude that the direction was wrong, that the effort was not working, that something else needs to be tried, and the accumulation of work that was building towards something, the compounding that was beginning to curve upward, gets abandoned, and the process begins again from a lower starting point. Long-term thinking is not just a virtue, it is a strategic advantage. In a world where most people operate on short-time horizons, the person who thinks in years and decades is operating in a different game entirely. They are not competing for the immediate result. They are building toward a much larger, much more durable outcome. And because they are not measuring against the short-term standard, they are not demoralized by the absence of short-term results. Let us understand why the short-term bias exists so strongly. The first reason is psychological. The human mind responds much more powerfully to immediate feedback than to delayed feedback. A reward that arrives now is neurologically more motivating than a reward that arrives later, even if the later reward is vastly larger. This is called temporal discounting, and it operates in all of us. The future feels less real than the present. The delayed consequence feels more abstract, and so behavior is pulled toward the immediate, even when the long-term choice would be obviously more beneficial. This is why it is hard to save money when spending money feels good now. Why it is hard to exercise when rest feels better in the moment. Why it is hard to do the deep work today when the shallow, easily rewarding activities are right there. The long-term benefit is real, but it does not feel as real as the immediate cost. The second reason is social. Short-term results are visible. They can be pointed to. They generate recognition and response from others. Long-term progress is largely invisible for most of its duration. The person in the middle of a 10-year project looks, for a very long time, like someone who is not getting anywhere. And in a culture that rewards visible results, the absence of visible progress is socially uncomfortable. It requires explaining. It requires holding a belief in a direction while the evidence of that belief's wisdom has not yet appeared. Most people cannot sustain that, not because they lack conviction, but because the social feedback loop is pulling against them. People around them who chose faster, more immediately rewarding directions are producing visible results. The comparison creates doubt. The doubt erodes commitment, and the long short-term direction gets abandoned. To think long-term requires a degree of comfort with being misunderstood, with choosing directions that are not immediately defensible to the people around you, with looking for extended periods, like someone who is going nowhere, while knowing internally that the trajectory is correct and the results are simply not yet visible. This comfort does not come from arrogance. It comes from genuine understanding of how growth works, from having internalized the mathematics of compounding, from having looked honestly at the long trajectories of people who built something meaningful and seen that the most interesting part of their story, the part where the results arrived, was preceded by a very long period that looked, from the outside, like nothing was happening. There is a concept worth spending time with here, the idea of the lag. In almost every system, there is a lag between input and output, between the effort and the result, between the cause and the effect. For simple systems, the lag is short. You press a button, the light comes on. But for complex systems, and becoming a more capable, more developed human being is a very complex system, the lag can be long months, sometimes years. During the lag, the input is real, the effort is real, the development is real. It is just not visible yet, because the system has not had time to convert it into output. And the danger of the lag is that it looks, from the inside, like the effort is not working. The results are not there. The feedback loop is not closing, and the absence of feedback creates doubt. The discipline of long-term thinking is largely the discipline of tolerating the lag, of continuing to put in the input, the daily work, the consistent effort, the deliberate development, even while the output is not yet apparent, of trusting the process not because you have evidence of results, but because you understand the mechanics well enough to know that results at this stage would be premature. Very few people can sustain this, and that is precisely why the ones who can find themselves in a fundamentally different position over time. There is a practical tool for developing the capacity to think long-term, and it is the practice of projecting forward. Instead of asking where you are right now, ask where you will be in 3 years if the current trajectory continues, in 5 years, in 10, not with false precision, but as a genuine exercise in trajectory thinking. If you continue doing what you are doing, in roughly the way you are doing it, what does that produce over a longer horizon? This question is clarifying in both directions. Sometimes the answer is encouraging. The current trajectory, extended forward, leads somewhere genuinely worthwhile, and the reminder of that destination is what sustains the effort through the difficult present. But sometimes the answer is sobering. The current trajectory, extended forward, does not lead anywhere particularly interesting. The daily habits, the patterns of thought, the investments of time and attention, when compounded over years, they produce a version of life that is not actually what you want. And that sobering answer is not discouraging. It is useful, because it surfaces in the present an awareness of where the current path leads, and gives you the opportunity to adjust before the destination is much closer. Most people only examine their trajectory when it is too late to make easy adjustments, when the path has been followed so long that the destination is already close. The practice of regularly projecting forward and honestly evaluating what you see means you are perpetually aware of the direction and perpetually in a position to correct if needed. Long-term thinking also changes how you relate to setbacks and failures. From a short-term perspective, a setback is a significant event. It represents lost ground, lost time, a disruption to the trajectory that feels in the moment deeply discouraging. The temptation is to catastrophize, to interpret the setback as evidence that the direction is wrong or that success in this area is not possible for you. From a long-term perspective, a setback is data. It is information about what does not work, applied in what conditions, under what circumstances. It is a teaching moment embedded in an extended process that is still very much continuing. The long-term perspective does not eliminate the discomfort of setbacks, but it changes their meaning. They are not endings. They are episodes, part of a longer story that is still being written. This reframing is not just emotionally useful. It is practically important, because the response to a setback determines whether it costs you the temporary loss or a much larger, longer disruption. The person who catastrophizes a setback and loses weeks or months to doubt and inaction pays a much higher price than the person who processes it quickly, extracts the learning and returns to the work. The long-term thinker pays the shorter price. Not because the setback affects them less, but because their frame is wide enough that the setback fits within it without overwhelming the overall picture. Finally, long-term thinking shapes the quality of the decisions you make about how to spend your time. When you are thinking in years and decades, rather than days and weeks, the criteria for where to invest attention shifts dramatically. Suddenly, the things that produce quick but shallow results matter less, and the things that build slowly but compound powerfully matter more. Time invested in genuine skill development, in deep understanding, in relationships that grow in depth and quality over years, in health practices that accumulate over a lifetime, in creative and intellectual work that builds on itself. These investments look boring in the short term. They produce no immediate dramatic results, but over a long time horizon, they produce something that short-term optimization cannot touch. A life that is genuinely built rather than merely reacted to. A set of capacities that were developed through patient, consistent investment rather than chased through constant pivoting. The crowd, on the whole, thinks short-term. It responds to the immediate. It chases the trend. It wants results now and loses patience with anything that takes too long. And because of this, the crowd tends to be perpetually reactive, moving toward whatever is visible and immediate, moving away from whatever is slow and invisible. The person who thinks long-term is not better than the crowd. But they are playing a different game. A game with different rules, different timelines, and different outcomes. And the longer they play it, the more distance opens between them and the short-term world. Not because they were born different, because they chose to think differently, and kept choosing it day after day, long enough for the compounding to arrive. There is a particular trap that many people fall into as they begin to grow. It is the trap of the announcement, of needing to tell people about the changes they are making, of performing their development for an audience, of measuring their progress by how different they appear to others rather than how different they are actually becoming. This trap is understandable. Change is difficult. It requires sustained effort over long periods. And when you are doing something difficult for an extended time, the desire for recognition is natural. You want the people around you to see what you are working toward, to acknowledge the effort, to affirm that you are on the right track. But announcements are also costly. And the cost is not obvious until you look at it carefully. When you announce your goals and intentions, something happens psychologically. The announcement creates a social reality around the goal. People know you are pursuing it. And that social reality provides a premature sense of completion. You have told the story. People have responded. The vision has been made real through sharing, and this can subtly undermine the hunger that fuels the actual work. Research on this phenomenon shows that people who share their goals in social contexts tend to do less toward achieving them than people who keep them private. The sharing creates the feeling of progress without the reality of it. And the feeling, because it is emotionally real, is enough to partially reduce the drive that was producing the effort. Beyond the psychological cost, announcements create a particular kind of vulnerability. They create expectations, and expectations create a performance dynamic. Instead of growing because you are committed to the growth, you are now growing, or trying to appear to grow, for an audience. You are managing their perceptions as much as you are developing yourself. And these two projects, Genuine development and managing perception are not the same project. They compete with each other. The most powerful growth tends to happen in silence. Not because silence is somehow mystically better, but because silence removes the performance dynamic. When no one is watching, when no one knows what you are working on, the only metric that matters is the internal one. Are you actually getting better? Is the work actually improving? Is the understanding actually deepening? These are the questions that produce real development, not the external questions, not how you appear, or what people think, or whether the announcement has been well received. There is something else about quiet growth that is worth understanding. It maintains the element of surprise. When you are working steadily and quietly, the gap between what others expect and what you are actually becoming continues to grow. People's perceptions of you are formed largely from past behavior and from what is visible to them, and if your development is happening internally, in the quality of your thinking, the depth of your understanding, the consistency of your habits, it may be largely invisible to people who interact with you casually. Over time, as the internal development begins to produce external results, the gap closes in ways that can be genuinely surprising to the people around you. They see a change that seems sudden to them, though it was years in the making. They encounter a capability or a quality in you that they did not know was there, because they were not privy to the slow, quiet process that produced it. This is not about deception. It is about the natural rhythm of genuine development. Real change is internal before it is external. It deepens before it expresses. And the people who are most surprised by your growth are usually the ones whose expectations of you were formed earliest and updated least often. To become different without announcing it is to trust the process of internal change. To accept that for an extended period, the work will be invisible. That you will be developing in ways that are not yet apparent to the people around you. That you will hold a vision of yourself that the current evidence does not yet support, and to find that acceptable, even comfortable. This is related to a quality that high performers in many fields tend to share. A quality that might be called quiet confidence. Not the kind of confidence that announces itself. Not the kind that needs to be validated by others or demonstrated through performance. The kind that simply knows. That is built on the internal evidence of consistent effort, genuine growth, and honest self-assessment. That does not need to be confirmed from outside, because it is not built from outside. Quiet confidence has a particular quality that is different from the louder, more visible varieties. It is unshakable in a different way. Because it is not dependent on external validation, it is not threatened by the absence of it. The person with quiet confidence does not need the people around them to recognize their growth, because they are not growing for the recognition. They are growing because they understand what they are building, and they are committed to building it. This does not mean you become closed. It does not mean you stop sharing yourself with the people around you or stop seeking feedback. It simply means that the drive, the motivation, the deepest commitment to the process that lives inside you, not in other people's reactions to you. There is a practical corollary to this. The people who grow most quietly are also often the people who are most genuine in their relationships. Because when you are not performing your growth, when you are not managing the image of who you are becoming, you can simply be present with the people around you. Without agenda, without the need to demonstrate anything, simply there. And there is something remarkably disarming about a person who has no particular need for you to think of them in a certain way, no agenda for how the interaction will position them. Simply present, genuinely engaged, interested in you rather than in how they appear to you. This quality is rarer than it should be, and it tends to create the kind of connections that deepen over time in ways that performance-based relationships cannot. As you grow, you will inevitably encounter people who do not understand the direction you are taking. people from your past who knew an earlier version of you and are uncertain how to relate to who you are becoming. People who feel, consciously or not, that your growth creates an uncomfortable distance. This is a delicate moment. The temptation is to either announce the growth, to explain and justify and demonstrate, or to suppress it, to shrink back to the version that makes the relationship comfortable. Neither of these serves you. What serves you is simply being yourself, the version of yourself that is genuinely there, without performance in either direction, not explaining the growth, not hiding it, simply inhabiting it, and letting the relationships find their natural level. Some relationships will deepen as you grow. The people in them will be interested in who you are becoming, curious about the directions you are taking, and capable of meeting you where you are. These relationships are valuable beyond measure. They are the ones that last. Other relationships will naturally shift, not in a dramatic way, but the resonance will change. The connection will become less frequent, less deep, less central. This is not a failure. It is a natural reorganization. The relationships that fit you best at one stage of growth are not always the same ones that fit you best at another. And allowing that reorganization to happen naturally, without force and without drama, is part of how you honor both your own growth and the genuine value of those relationships. Quiet growth is also about learning to find satisfaction in the process itself. Not in the announcement, not in the recognition, not in the moment when people around you notice the change, but in the actual work, in the daily discipline, in the private moments of insight and development and genuine progress. This kind of satisfaction is more durable than the external kind. It does not depend on what others see or say. It is available every day in every session of genuine effort, and building the capacity to find it, to value the internal experience of growth rather than the external perception of it, is one of the most important developments you can undergo, because eventually everything comes from the inside. The discipline, the vision, the commitment to continue. If these are fed primarily by external validation, they will falter whenever the validation is absent, and validation is often absent for long stretches during the most important periods of growth. But if they are fed from inside, from a genuine understanding of what you are building and why it matters, from the quiet daily satisfaction of doing the work well, from the self-respect that comes from consistent self-honoring, they are available to you always, in the difficult days and the easy ones, in the visible stretches and the invisible ones. That is the kind of inner resource that makes everything else possible, and it is built through the same process as everything else in this audiobook. Quietly, consistently, over time, without announcement, without performance, simply by doing the work and trusting the process. You have traveled through a particular kind of territory in this audiobook. Not dramatic territory, not the territory of sudden breakthroughs and explosive transformations. Quieter territory than that, more internal, more demanding in a different way. The territory of honest self-examination, of patient effort, of deliberate development that does not ask for recognition and does not depend on it. Let us hold what you have encountered here. You began by looking honestly at the pull of the crowd, not to condemn it, not to feel superior to it, but to see it clearly, to understand that the crowd's influence is not a sign of weakness in you. It is the natural operation of deeply wired social instincts. The difference, as you now understand, is awareness. The crowd's pull does not disappear when you become aware of it, but awareness creates a space, a pause, a moment in which something different becomes possible. You looked at your environment, at the way it shapes the patterns of your thinking and your behavior, at the assumptions it embeds in you without your asking, at the ceiling it may set on what you expect of yourself, and you discovered that environments can be changed, not always dramatically, but specifically, deliberately, by adjusting the conditions, by expanding the range of people and ideas you are influenced by by growing in directions that your current surroundings did not predict, by tolerating the discomfort of being slightly out of sync, not as a permanent state, but as the temporary feeling of expansion. You explored the automatic patterns of your own thinking, the shortcuts, the assumptions, the inherited beliefs that run like background programs, shaping your perceptions and responses without announcing themselves. You discovered that these patterns are not fixed, that the first step in changing them is seeing them. That curiosity, directed honestly at your own mind, is one of the most powerful tools available to you, and that the mind that can observe itself is the mind that can evolve itself. You sat with the discipline of consistency, with the understanding that performance is not built on intensity alone, but on regularity, on showing up every day in some form, regardless of the psychological weather, on building a relationship with your own work that is not conditional on motivation, on understanding that the compound curve of consistent effort, while invisible in the early stages, becomes everything over time, and that the patience required to stay in the process through the invisible middle is not a passive patience. It is an active choice, made daily. You examined your attention. You saw clearly that it is not a given, that it is actively competed for by a world that has sophisticated systems for capturing it, and that to protect your focus is not a luxury or an indulgence. It is one of the most consequential choices you make about your life, because your attention is where your life actually happens, and the degree to which you allow it to be fragmented and consumed determines the degree to which the things that matter most to you remain unbuilt. You looked far forward. You understood that the time horizon through which you evaluate your progress determines whether the process is sustainable. That most people's internal clocks are set too short. That meaningful growth requires a willingness to invest over years and trust the compounding even when the results are not yet visible. That setbacks, seen from a long perspective, are not disruptions but data, and that the long-term thinker is playing a different game from the crowd, not because they have more patience in a passive sense, but because they have a clearer and more accurate understanding of how things actually compound. And you settled into the quiet truth of growing without announcement, without performance, without needing the people around you to register what is happening inside you, without measuring your progress by external validation, simply working, developing, becoming, steadily and privately, the person you are building toward. These are not techniques. They are not tricks or shortcuts. They are ways of being, orientations of mind and character that, when genuinely inhabited and practiced, produce a life that is fundamentally different from the life that results from moving with the crowd. Not different in the sense of being opposed to others, not different in the sense of being superior or separate, different in the sense of being genuinely yours, built from your own thinking, moving in a direction you actually chose, growing toward something that is authentically yours to build. The crowd is not your enemy. It is simply not your guide. It cannot be, because the crowd does not know what your life is for. It does not know what you are here to build, who you are here to become, what you are here to contribute. Only you can know those things, and you can only know them clearly if your thinking is genuinely your own. This is what you have been given here, not the answers, but the practices that lead to clarity. Not the destination, but the habits of mind and action that allow you to find it, stay on it, and build something real along the way. So go forward quietly, do the work, think your own thoughts, protect your focus, stay in the process through the invisible middle, think in years and decades, let the growth be internal before it is external, and trust with a patient and grounded certainty that what you are building, day by day, session by session, choice by choice, is real. You do not need to compete with the crowd. You need to think for yourself, grow at your own pace, and act with consistency, because the moment you stop following is the moment you begin to separate, not from other people, from who you used to be. and that distance, quiet, private, steady, is the only distance that truly matters.